You're listening to Coffee and Culture. We're on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC, streaming at santafe.com. My name is Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm your host every other week, more or less. And today I'm talking with Kyle Paoletta. His new book, American Oasis, is just out now, January 2025. And he will be speaking in conversation with Sarah Dant at Collected Works Bookstore in downtown Santa Fe on Friday, January 24th at 6 p.m. So come out for that if all of this sounds interesting. And the book is called American Oasis, and it's a sort of a view of, you can describe it better than me, but I will describe it as a view of America through these cities in the Southwest that have grown over the last uh, several hundred years. Albuquerque, Tucson, Las Vegas, Phoenix, um, El Paso, uh, each of which has its own sort of unique trajectory and story, even though in a lot of ways we think of them as the same. They're the way they developed through indigenous culture and Spanish culture and American culture, all sort of had different aims and purposes and approaches. And Kyle grew up here in New Mexico in Albuquerque. Uh, I don't know if I mentioned that. That's one of the cities where he also writes about. And so it's just a fascinating sort of arc of history and contemporary issues around water, things like that. So welcome, Kyle. Great to have you here.
Yeah, this is such a pleasure. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I think the one-liner that I've been using to describe the book is it's kind of a people's and environmental history of the Southwest, and one that I think helps, people in the rest of the country anticipate the world that they are starting to live in with climate change,
Right.
as, heat and water scarcity and the stuff that we've dealt with for centuries, if not millennia in the Southwest, are suddenly they are issues everywhere. And I think there's a lot people can learn from us.
Yeah. One thing you say in the book is a bit about how sort of the desert being a crucible for culture and for that a lot of worldwide cultures have arisen out of the desert. And I find that intriguing way of looking. It's sort of this people, I don't know if it's because of the harsh conditions that people have to work together and make culture to survive, but also because it's some perceived of as some sort of blank slate where there's this broad canvas that we can create upon, make our imprint.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of what made me want to write the book is, I've been living on the East Coast in New York and Boston for the better part of 2 decades. And having grown up in New Mexico, everyone you meet is sort of like bewildered by the existence of cities in the desert, especially a city like Phoenix or Las Vegas. They just have this real sense of like it doesn't compute. Like, how can that be? And so, yeah, I do think there's an odd unwillingness to accept civilization in the desert, even though you go back to ancient Egypt, Sumeria, like the beginnings of recorded history was in the desert, like the origins of human culture in many ways, or sort of settled human culture is in the desert. And yeah, I do agree that when you live in a place of extremity, you have to band together to survive. And that's where civilization comes from. That's where culture comes from.
Yeah. Um, One thing I learned in your book, which I hadn't realized, was the amount of, um, obviously in the desert and as cities grow in the desert, water is a huge issue, and it's been dealt with differently in different places. And Phoenix is sort of in your book the most extreme, it feels like, uh, instance of just growth, 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 and we'll figure out the water later, maybe
Yeah.
somehow. Um, and
Eventually, maybe we'll figure it out.
as opposed to Las Vegas, which Las Vegas, in the sort of popular imagination and in the larger culture, is sort of looked down on, including by myself largely, as like this horrendous place that I would never want to go to and I avoid at all costs. Um, and it's this sort of just mirage, and it's this manufactured place that isn't really there, and it's all about um, money and no culture. But you sort of show it in a different light, including this incredible amount of water reclamation and recycling. 40% of the water that's pumped out of Lake Mead to fuel the city is put back in Lake Mead. And so it becomes this loop of water use
Yeah.
that is fascinating. And hadn't really thought about it, but it really sort of sparked my imagination of like, is this as a model um, for the world?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Las Vegas is the most efficient water user in the country, certainly among the most efficient water users in the world. And I think it's because they've been forced to be. Like
Mhm.
the as scarce as water is in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Phoenix and El Paso, there is so much less water in the Las Vegas Valley. And so there you had a situation where basically it's called Las Vegas, the grassy plain, because there were these artesian springs
Hmm.
when settlers, first Mormon settlers, and then later other Anglo settlers came there. And they basically sucked up all the water from those springs by the 1960s. And that's when you first had the pipe going to Lake Mead. And then, in the 90s, they were already using more water from the Colorado River than Nevada was entitled to, and were basically forced to come up with this recycling system and make these big investments in water recycling because that is basically the only source of water they have. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think as in some ways the reputation for profligate water use is well earned when you're looking at all these enormous golf courses and the Bellagio fountains are always kind of the famous example. Um, but I think that obscures sort of necessity being the mother of invention. And what Las Vegas has done is now what many places are doing. I mean, Los Angeles is spending about $8 billion on a water recycling system. San Diego is spending 3 billion. Phoenix has its own multi-billion dollar project that are all this premise of we have all this wastewater. If we could just reuse it, suddenly we take much less from the rivers, we don't need these gas guzzling water reclamation, like desalination plants in the ocean. Like, if we can reuse what we have, it's so much more
Right. Because
sustainable.
it's much more efficient energy wise to use to reclaim wastewater than to desalinate.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I get into it in the book, but water desalination is one of the most energy intensive processes. And if you want to run a desalination plant overnight, you basically have to burn natural gas or coal at this point. So yeah, it would be quite um, catastrophic for emissions if we turn
To
to
that.
to that as the solution.
Yeah, I think they have some of that in San Diego, some desal plant.
Yeah,
But
there's one plant that is operational there, and if you look in globally in the Gulf, like the Persian Gulf, basically all of those states, they get their water from desalinating it, but it's because they burn a tremendous amount of
right,
oil to do it.
right. They don't mind using up oil. They have lots
No,
of it over there.
no.
We got to go to a break. We'll be right back. I'm talking with Kyle Paoletta. He'll be reading and talking from his book, American Oasis, at Collected Works on January 24th at 6 p.m. We'll be right back. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm talking with Kyle Paoletta. My name is Matthew Chase Daniel. Kyle's new book is just coming out now in January of this year called American Oasis. And you'll be in conversation. Kyle will be in conversation with Sarah Dant, who's the author of Losing Eden: An Environmental History of the American Southwest, another book that describes this long history of the Southwest. Chaco Canyon and here in the Southwest, there were these larger settlement civilizations that were abandoned and maybe largely due to climate change in around 1100. Um, and those peoples maybe resettled along the Rio Grande where there was more reliable water in smaller settlements, and are the Puebloan people um, that we know here now. And it's a bit, and those, Chaco had huge roads and they were bringing timber from mountains very far away. And, it was very um, remarkable and large scale when you look at it. Not large scale compared to Phoenix or Las Vegas now, but large scale at the time. And is there some lesson there in terms of adaptability or lack of adaptability?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the key themes in the book, I think, is this idea of what does it take to survive in the desert? What is the way that we can have a sustainable city here, neighborhood, house? Like at every level, how do we live sustainably in this place of very scarce resources? And I think kind of one thing that I try to show the full arc of in the long history of the Southwest is you have the people who lived at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, these cliff dwelling peoples, and along the Salt River in what's now Arizona, you have the ancestral Sonoran Desert people who dug out these irrigation canals that were
Mhm.
found by white settlers hundreds of years after they had quote unquote disappeared. And that, you know, there is this long history of living in the desert and being able to really thrive there. And especially talking about a place like Chaco Canyon of just a spectacular, at its height, spectacular center of culture and coexistence in this very rough place. And so we sort of start there. And as you allude to, there are climatic changes that seem to force people to migrate and to go to different places. And I sort of, in the book, reject this idea of like the mysterious thing vanishing, which I think is a narrative that serves the Anglo settler idea of the desert as a blank page to be
That
filled.
you mean that
But
an idea that these people vanished, not that they
right,
moved and adapted.
right, because I think it's very clear that the cliff dwellers were the ancestors of the Puebloan people who are our neighbors today. The ancestral Sonorans became the O'odham peoples who, continue to live along the Gila and the Santa Cruz River, and so on. So I think it's much more there's a story of kind of migration that certainly happened before colonization. But I think once you get to colonization, what you have is this enforcement of a different style of life, a mode of life drawn from not just the East Coast and the Midwest of America, but England and Germany and France,
Hmm.
right? This idea that rainfall follows the plow. If we create these farms, suddenly we will reclaim the desert. And that's where the Bureau of Reclamation gets its name. This idea that in this imagined past, this was a verdant, like this was Ohio, and we have to
Right.
reclaim it to that.
That's
And I
interesting. Yeah.
and I think that's how you get these huge sprawling cities and the the dependence on cars, it's that is the logical extension of this importation of a different style of life that is not suitable to the desert. And I think at the end of the book, I kind of get back to how did people live here before? And they live communally. Like Pueblos, if you look at Taos Pueblo, is effectively an enormous apartment complex,
Right.
right? Like this idea of kind of like living densely, communally, taking care of your neighbors, living, you know, seasonally and relying on local food. Like all of these kind of systems exist, and we have the technology now that we can tap into them at a much larger scale than those ancestral societies did. And, when we're talking about Las Vegas, that's a version of it.
Right. I
Um,
think there was this whole my grandparents, my father's parents were from grew up in Connecticut, but ended up in the end of their life living in Mesa, Arizona, um,
mm,
in a trailer park there. And they moved there because of bad arthritis, and the desert was better. And I know a lot of people who dealt with asthma and allergies and things left these green, verdant East Coast climates and moved to the desert in around Phoenix for their health, and then brought with them all the trees and flowers and stuff that they loved that they were allergic to
right.
on the East Coast, and tried and to recreate that in their yards in Phoenix,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I
then
mean,
suffered from the same thing all over again. And it was
it,
that reclamation and recreation of this sort of idealized version of how the world should be or whatever is fascinating.
yeah. Well, and if you go to, the Phoenix area now, there's an enormous lake in Tempe, and there's all these kind of yeah, like all of these created man-made lakes and water features. I have a good friend there who had grown up in Phoenix, and the last time I was there, she was telling me that, she'd grown up there and then lived in New York for a while and then moved back. And she was like, it's humid here now because when
Right.
it gets so hot and there's all of these man-made lakes and they just evaporate and it creates humidity in one of the hottest deserts in the continent.
Right.
It's
Or
crazy.
those outdoor cafes that have the sprayers going
The
constantly.
misters,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
We don't have that here in Santa Fe, in New
No,
Mexico. We've
luckily.
never gone that way. Um, the other thing I've always remark when I visit pueblos around here is that there's the sort of agricultural area by the river with the acequias, and there's a lot of green and growth there. But in the villages, in the pueblos themselves, no one, people aren't planting a lot of shade trees, and they're not planting a lot of
Hmm.
flowers and a lot. It's very dry and stark, and it is what is there. And there's sort of this division between adaptive ways of living in the desert. Like we need our water to grow our food, and for drinking water, we don't need it for this other things. And so how to live um, in that balanced way, which that got my, when I was reading your book and being reminded or learning about the Las Vegas water reclamation. So 60% of the water goes to the golf courses and the trees and the flowers and the Bellagio fountain and all that, and 40% goes to domestic use, of which 99% of that 40% is reclaimed, which
Yeah,
is if you lived in the Pueblo version of Las Vegas without the golf courses, and it was all contained like the Bellagio whole, these casinos are like these indoor worlds, um, and you recycled 99% of that, it becomes this sort of almost endless cycling loop of resource.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if the only thing they used water for was showering, cooking, drinking, doing household tasks, they would have all the water they need, like in perpetuity, basically. And I think it's a valuable lesson for all of us about kind of yeah, not projecting a lifestyle on the landscape that doesn't fit. I mean, when I was reporting that part of the book, I talked to Pat Mulroy, who is the sort of legendary head of the water utility in Las
Right,
Vegas for about 20 years. And she's just she's hilarious to talk to, very spunky, has a lot of attitude. She's kind of a great character. But she had told me that um, one of the hardest things that, or one of the toughest sells that she had as kind of getting Las Vegas into this new paradigm that they're in now from what they used to do was stopping people from washing their cars every week.
right,
That, like, I think in the book she says something about like, I didn't realize that for many senior citizens, washing your car once a week is like such an important part of whatever your idea of
right,
being an American that you brought to Las Vegas from Michigan, Connecticut,
right.
Tennessee, whatever.
I have to interrupt. We have to go to another break. We'll be right back. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. We're on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC, streaming at santafe.com. Podcasts are at chasedaniel.com or on any major podcast platform. Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel, talking with Kyle Paoletta, and talking about how the culture of old men washing their cars in Las Vegas was one of the hardest things to address, and just sort of um, how culture moves and exists and adapts, and we're in this time of major climate change, which can be mitigated somewhat by our behavior and is somewhat just on its runaway course, out of our control at these points. And Kyle's book, American Oasis, is sort of about how looking at the Southwest and the cities of the Southwest can give us lessons for what is coming around the country and around the world, with resource. And it's more about water, but there's also resources of energy and um, which are all tied together. And a lot of water
Yeah.
resources use energy resources. And um, I was thinking about how I guess the Las Vegas is maybe 2,000 feet above Lake Mead, maybe. So there's using gravity, they're pumping water up to the city and then it's running down the Las Vegas wash back to Lake Mead.
Hmm.
Um, and then I was thinking about, okay, how does Los Angeles, that's all basically at sea level, um, and just dumps all their wastewater into the ocean at this point. How do you retrofit these systems
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
these
I mean,
other
it's much more
cities?
challenging. In some ways, Las Vegas is able to be such a uh, sort of pioneer of water reuse because of its geography, because its proximity to Lake Mead, which is not accidental. I mean, Las Vegas doesn't, I don't believe it's founded as a settlement until around like 1906, 1908, and it doesn't really start growing until the construction of the Hoover Dam
When was
uh,
that Hoover Dam
in
built?
the 30s, in
Yeah.
the 1930s. So, and then it's, in the 40s that you have, criminal syndicates coming in, and it remains Nevada was the only state that had legal gambling, and it kind of goes from there. But anyways, this kind of geography that allows it to just recycle by returning water to its water source. As you point out, a city like Los Angeles doesn't have that luxury, nor even does Albuquerque or Phoenix or most of the cities that I write about in the book. But I think that is where the kind of like technology that we have comes in, where we do have the ability to build, amazing water filtration plants and then recirculate that water through plumbing systems. It just costs a lot more than cleaning all the water and then dumping it into the Las Vegas wash, and then it goes to Lake Mead on its own. So
Right,
I think the technology exists, but yeah, that is why the price tag is much higher in many of these communities.
right. There's also, are there injection wells? Is that a thing where water's treated and then injected back into the aquifer and then
Yeah.
pumped out and retreated that way
Yeah,
in
I mean
places?
that's a big program in Arizona actually, is often water that is, there everyone in the Southwest is incentivized to quote unquote use all of the water you're entitled to, right? I mean, it's like an academic who gets a certain amount of money from their department every year. They're incentivized to keep using all that money so that they get more.
Right.
But so Arizona, if the water they draw from the Colorado River or from the Verde or the Salt, if they don't use all of it, it's re-injected into aquifers and becomes part of the storage. And yeah, so those programs exist as well, and I think there are some ideas about places that get a lot of their water from the ground. Maybe the way to recycle is to do exactly what you're saying.
Uh-huh. There's so much of the water in the West is used for agriculture. And a lot of that agriculture is even like growing alfalfa for to ship to Saudi Arabia for racing camels and
Yeah,
strange things like that. Um, and but also like the whole Imperial Valley of California being growing a lot of the fresh vegetables for the whole country, not just for that area,
yeah,
and using water. And I was looking online this morning at the Colorado River allocation and where the different amounts go. And a tiny bit goes to New Mexico and a tiny bit goes to Nevada, and a lot goes to Colorado, and a real lot goes to California. And of that, and I think you addressed this in your book a bit, is cities of San Diego and Los Angeles buying up the rights to the water in the Imperial Valley that's used for agriculture. And how does that balance work? Like it's very
yeah,
um,
yeah.
interesting to think of getting rid of that agriculture and finding growing stuff where there's more water and having people be able to live there. But maybe that's not the right way. I don't know.
Well, it's a tricky balance. I mean, so the Imperial Valley in California on its own uses more water than the entire state of Arizona. I should say it draws more water from the Colorado River than the entire state of Arizona.
Hmm.
And yeah, a lot of that water grows, most of the lettuce that is consumed in the United States in the winter. There are other kind of leafy greens, but much of it does go to alfalfa and to basically feed for livestock that, then gets slaughtered and sold as beef or is used by dairies and so on. So it is a relatively vital part of the national food system. At the same time, when you have, 40 million people who rely on the Colorado River, most of them in big cities, and they're only using 20% of the river. Like one of the people I talked to in the book is John Ensminger, who's the head of the Las Vegas water utility. And he often says, you know, if we're talking about cutting how much water all of us get from this one river, you're not going to have a situation where Los Angeles and Las Vegas and Phoenix and Albuquerque are running out of water, but they're growing as much alfalfa as they want in the Imperial Valley and around Yuma. Like it's kind of nonsensical. And so that's how you get what you alluded to of these water trades of basically paying farmers not to farm, which has that, like, if people have been following negotiations over the Colorado in recent years, that is how we have not run out of water. That is how we haven't, um, seen plunging levels at Lake Mead. But there's a limit to how much you can do. At what point do you need those farmers? And how swiftly can what they're growing be shifted to the Midwest? Or, like it is, we are kind of approaching the limits of how much we can ask from agriculture, which is going to be a big conversation in the coming
Yeah.
years.
We're going to go to another break. We'll be right back. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm talking with Kyle Paoletta about his book, American Oasis. He'll be in conversation with Sarah Dant at Collected Works on Friday, January 24th at 6 p.m. So come by, pick up a copy of the book that's just coming out. Um, and in New Mexico, you were talking a bit about how people are incentivized to use their water in Arizona. And in, New Mexico, we've long had water rights are always very contentious and very important and are part of sort of a system of water apportionment that has been in place for a long time here. I don't know, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. I'm not
I
sure.
would say closer to 500 years. I
Yeah,
think a lot of the water systems go back to the Spanish. Yeah.
right. And in California, in our Central Valley of California and stuff, you don't really see that. There's like somewhat unregulated pumping of groundwater and
Mm.
use of water. Um, and New Mexico has that use it or lose it for a long time, which is if you have water rights and you don't actually take them out of the acequia and put them on your land, over time, those get reapportioned elsewhere, and which is not necessarily a great inspiration for conservation. Um, but it feels like, and this is something, I guess what I'm getting at is there's something in your book too about how like cities like El Paso and Albuquerque and to some degree Tucson have taken a very different approach to growth. Um,
Mm.
and sort of at the heart of your whole book is about that people need to work together and look out for each other and work as a community in order to solve our problems moving into the future. And that cities like maybe Phoenix and Las Vegas are more these sort of outsiders coming in and imposing themselves on the desert and saying, we want it to be this way. Whereas a city like Albuquerque is sort of slowly growing and bumbling along and never this huge expanding population and economic powerhouse and fantasy place for people to retire to from
Mm.
Ohio or wherever.
Yeah.
Um,
For no lack of trying, I'll say, because I think you're totally right that in the book I draw a real division line between Phoenix and Las Vegas on one side, and then Albuquerque, El Paso, Tucson, and Santa Fe on the other, where I have this idea of kind of the new Southwest and the old Southwest. And in New Mexico, we're very much the old Southwest. Like it is not just the pueblos, but the history of Spanish colonization and the all of our cities are much older and the population centers are much older. Whereas Phoenix and Las Vegas, it was possible for white people to come from the Midwest and just kind of develop their dreamscape, which apparently looks like a golf course in most cases for whatever reason.
right,
Um, Whereas I think there were attempts to do that in Albuquerque and El Paso, but the problem was there were a lot of indigenous people, there were a lot of Mexicans. You couldn't pretend that it was a blank place. Like
right,
the history was so palpable. And I think in the mid 20th century, that was seen as a liability by the kind of Anglo boosters who were
hmm
trying to attract investment from elsewhere. And I think now it is really what makes our cities in the old Southwest, to me at least, so much more culturally vibrant and dynamic. Um, and so I think, yeah, that's what we need to lean into, that spirit of kind of like living in this challenging place together.
right. And yeah, there's so much history, not only history of those cultures, but knowledge that comes from living in a place for hundreds or thousands of years and
Yeah.
how to live there. And of course, the modern world that we live in, or the postmodern world, whatever world we're in, um, we have technologies and stuff that allow us to do things that we couldn't do 200 years ago. Um, but I do think that it is what it's not, it wasn't a blank slate, and it wasn't only something that got in the way of creating some fantasy world, but it was that those things were always valued in the
Mm,
politics and in, because um, once people were voting, they were voting to preserve their culture and ways
yeah.
of life. And you also talk in there about how Albuquerque was founded as two cities. There was New Albuquerque and Old Albuquerque, and that there was at one point there was a sort of an attempt to make New Albuquerque the other thing, the more like the
Hmm.
Phoenix thing maybe, and
Yeah.
that didn't really take, and it all became one Albuquerque. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean,
there's
I think
Go ahead.
as much as my book is sort of explaining the Southwest to the rest of the country, I'm hoping that the book is also explaining the Southwest to itself. And like, as someone who
Yeah,
grew up in Albuquerque, I had no idea that it was two cities until 1953.
yeah.
That, like, when we say Albuquerque was founded in, I think it's 1704, 1706,
Hmm.
that's the original Via de Albuquerque, which is now Old Town. And New Albuquerque, which was founded around the train station, was in the 1880s. And there were 70 years of New Albuquerque growing really rapidly while Old Town was kind of shut out. And there were all of these things that were done to basically make the ancestral practices of the Mexican American families there illegal. And then in 1953, this New Albuquerque annexes Old Albuquerque. It becomes one city, but it adopts this original birthday so that it can assume that sense of history.
Right,
And I think I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about the ways in which, like, in New Mexico, we talk about our three cultures, and I think it's a beautiful ideal, but it's also a very contentious one that even in Santa Fe, you had the Entrada pageant for years of this myth of the peaceful reconquest of 1692 of, the Puebloans welcoming Pedro de Peralta back.
right.
And it wasn't real. Like, it was a
No, it was
violent
not real. Yeah.
reconquest.
And we're coming to terms with that in Santa Fe finally in the last
Yes, yes,
decade or so.
absolutely. Which has
And
been wonderful to see finally take place.
right, but it still remains really difficult because, well, Santa Fe also is not immune to some romantic ideal boosterism, for
Oh,
sure,
absolutely.
that has crossed the planet. Um, and But yeah, like with the Soldiers Monument, the obelisk in
Mhm.
the center of the plaza being torn down, and now inside an ugly brown box. And how do we move forward? Do we move that? Do we rebuild that? Do we tear it down and do something else? Do we
Yeah,
contextualize it? Do we, you know, um, no one is able to move forward on it because everyone feels so strongly about it in every direction possible, and to try
absolutely.
and reach some sort of understanding. So yeah, I think that three culture mythology is, first of all, there's a lot more than three, and the Pueblo culture is a lot different than the Diné culture or the
Hmm.
Comanche culture, and um,
Absolutely.
that's not one monolithic thing. And the Spanish culture, the Norteño culture is much different than the Mexican immigrant culture, and there's Asians and blacks and
Yeah,
all sorts
absolutely.
of
We
cultures.
are much more diverse than the idea of three cultures gives us credit for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Anglos are like you and I aren't very Anglo. Um,
Yeah.
we're Jewish and Italian and
Yeah. I mean,
German
once upon
and
a time, certainly, one set of my grandparents were immigrants from Sicily. The other set were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Neither group would have been thought of as white when they got here,
right.
which is not to, like, I obviously exist in contemporary America as a white man, but I do talk a little bit about my family's immigration story
Yeah.
to just sort of in a chapter about immigration, about just like the idea of what is an American is a really flexible one that changes every couple years. And like we need to like keep letting it change and keep letting it evolve rather than enforcing this fixed idea that we unfortunately see in our national politics today.
Yeah. Well, we've run through our 40 minutes. So thank you so much, Kyle. And everyone, come out for the talk and reading at Collected Works in Santa Fe, January 24th at 6 p.m., or just pick up a copy of the book called American Oasis, Kyle Paoletta, Paolettata, originally from Albuquerque, now living in the East and writing for all sorts of papers and magazines and doing good work. And first big book out there. So congratulations and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. This has been a great conversation.